we will talk in a different order. First the fetching and then the controlled inputs, but I mean they don't interfere with each other. Again, our component is still the same, right? Now I will just open this console log. Results. Oh, I need console, right? So until here, we know what's happening, right? Our again, right now we can forget the header component because we are working inside of repositories. So that's also a thing, for instance, in React and all whatever library uses components, is that if the components are side by side, whatever you do in one will never affect the other. So that's also a good way of, if you have all your components listed in a row, it's just a bit hard to structure a website like that. But if you do, then you know that they do not interfere on each other. So mainly, we're going to be looking at the repositories component. And as in the previous class, the repositories contains as a map of repositories, and then it prints out another component called repository. So this is the two that we're going to be looking at, basically. So as we know from the how a React component works, when it gets rendered, whatever is inside of the return function, all the JSX gets printed. So as you can see here, we have an input and then another input, then a button, and then a div with a lot of repositories. So whenever we inspect the website here, and actually I will start using this one, as now you guys know, the repositories component in here does not really show many information because everything is empty, right? Mm-hmm. Because again, the React components tool only shows components, does not show HTML code. So for that, you need to inspect the code as you would do before. So if we go here, yes, we have our input fields and then repository list. Now, the reason why no repositories are being printed, if we just console log here, our repository list, and maybe I'll put it right next to it so it's not misleading. So when we are logging here, it's empty. So that's also an easy or an interesting way that, for instance, whenever you're fetching data, you don't want the website to basically stop while the data is being loading. That's also why we make it asynchronous, so that the website is actually loaded, like the website works completely fine, but the data actually comes a bit after. And you can see by having the list here, even by the way that they get triggered. So first we print the list and only then we print the results. And that's exactly because that's what's happening. The results are asynchronous. So we only get the results a little bit after the website loads. So I will, first I will actually put data inside of this one, because this repository list, as seen up here, is a state, right? And it's an empty array. That's why we can actually use map. If we would do this, for instance, it's empty. Now it complains. Yeah. And the reason why it complains is because down here, we are using the repository list as a map. So that needs to be an array or an object, but we know it. We want it to be an array. So for that, we need to give it the initial value, as we always do on a use state. So it just says like, oh yeah, it's empty. I don't do anything. There is nothing to print out there. So now here on our use effect, we only want it to run once. We don't want to run for it to run every time, like every time something happens on a page. So because of that, we have this little guy down here, which And the reason why we wanted to run once is because we want to fetch data, basically. So we don't want to keep fetching data, otherwise the website breaks eventually. So as I explained before, we are calling a function here called getData that I created here that returns or executes a promise of an await fetch, and we log the results here. So now these results that we are logging here looks exactly like what we need for our page to work, right? Because it has a name and a description. So that's exactly what we need. And sometimes you might be like, oh, but there is so many data here, like how come that happens? Basically, it just maps to whatever we are asking for. We are only asking for name and description. That's why we are only, but if we would be asking for I don't know, a fork or URL, we would get those as well because they are here. So now the only thing we need to do is to use the set repositories to update the state. So basically, the use effect will say, we're going to run once, and whenever we have this data, so whenever the result waits and has a response, then we will update the repositories. And because we are doing a state change, that will update the whole component as we learned. So by updating the whole component, then we will render whatever repositories comes in. So now I will save this. And as you can actually see on the background, it already updated. So, and now you can see here, this is still our print, our console log down here. So basically what happened is the component rendered, right? But the initial state of the list is empty because we actually set it to empty. And then the promise got resolved. We got all our objects, and we set the state. So now our list actually contains exactly what's there. If we expand it, it will contain exactly. And because we had previously already built these components, we just feed the data into it. So I will expand this list here. As you can see, is exactly the same as whatever was there on the result one. So now we have this data in state. And that's why we can show it there. And that's also why, if we refresh, it jumps. You can see, for instance, welcome to Git room, or even the fields there, they do not blink at all because they are there, they are static. Right? They get rendered. But this one gets rendered a little bit after because, I mean, we can see it here. We don't have a time of when, but we can see that first this happens, then this happens, then this happens. That's why it blinks, because we are updating the components. And then down here, this is exactly what we had last week, if we forget about this one. So I'm just basically passing the key, the name, the description, and the star. Now, I'm not really passing a star, and the reason is because that does not exist as a value, basically. So when you look here on a result from GitHub, or I mean, this one is easier to look at. Whenever you query GitHub, there is no such thing as star anywhere marked here, but there is but there is the stargazers count. So I'm just doing that. I'm just saying, like, oh, instead of star, I know that the return type from GitHub is stargazers count. So in here, I'm just passing that one. Because again, in this repo object inside of this map, I have this entire object, this very, very long one that I can use for whatever I want. So yeah, so if we want to use the URL or whatever, we can always add that. And that's also why a lot of times when you visit the website, there are some things that come a little bit after. And that's exactly the reason why. It's because there was a call made to an API that fetches the data, and then now I have the data, now update the components that uses this data. Also, if we look at our network tab here, somewhere we should have the GitHub thingy. Yeah, it's this one. being called eventually, right? So it's called repos, yeah. And as you can see, like first we actually asked for the page, which is the local host in this case. Then we loaded all the JavaScript that it needs to run. And then inside the JavaScript somewhere, we are doing a fetch. So that's exactly what this one is doing. And then, yeah, the other ones are just some other stuff that React needs to work with. To worry with that. So yeah, basically fetching an API, the only thing you need is this. Of course, I put the fetch URL out here, but you can have it. I mean, it's just an assignment of a variable. But this is basically what you would need. You need some state to manage it, and then set it to. And again, like we had before of removing one of the objects, we can still do that, probably. Will it work? Probably not. Oh yeah, I removed the thing here. Yeah, that's right. And I will explain what's happening there. So we can still do this, but I did not remove it from my GitHub right now. I just removed it from the state. So if I refresh the page, they are there again. Now, of course, this is not how a final application looks like, especially because you should not be able to just delete repositories. You need to authenticate and whatever. But somewhere on the handle of the delete, you would have to call the API again. So, but we are not doing that right now. Right now, we just want to control state, basically. So yeah, that again, this is the most common use of the use effect. Just to say, run only once and get me the data I need and set it to the state of this component so that now my component can do things.
Can you show me the delete, what you did in the delete?
Yeah. The delete, basically, I make a copy of the current state, and then I remove the ID, which is the index, and then I update the whole repository lists again. So basically, whenever we click delete, this entire component, yeah, actually now we should be able to see it. Yeah, true. So if I do delete, this whole component repositories got updated. You don't see. You think like, oh, only one left. No, but the whole thing got updated because we are setting state on the whole components. And we are setting the whole repository list again. It's just that it's really, really fast. But again, this is the way to do it for now. Of course, if you have a very, very big list, there is ways to improve of how to remove a specific item of it. But for now, and you should also not have a very big list of things and use a delete like that. It should be something very, very different. But yeah, but basically we need the whole repository list to update. And yeah, now you can see that whenever we load, now the repository has 3 repositories inside. So in here you can actually see the structure of the components, and you can also see the props that you are sending to it and the state inside of it. So for instance, repositories does not have any prop. It's empty because we are not asking for anything here. But when you go to repositories, repository, that one has a lot of props, because if we check here, we are asking for all those things. So in here, it's even actually very easy to understand what your component needs to run, basically.
Marco, why didn't you pass the value of the repository and the user cap? Where in fact it changed.
You mean here?
Yeah.
Because we only want this to run once.
Even if the values of the repositories and the state has changed?
Yeah, because for instance, if we do this, but then I have to cancel it, this will probably create, yeah, an infinite loop. And now I need to cancel it. Because basically it's saying like, oh, if the repository list changes, please update. But the repository list always changes because we are always setting it. So it's empty, and then we set it with the result. So basically it changed, so it does again and again and again, and then it will never stop. And that's why, again, the fetching data is a very tricky one. If you need to fetch data, always use this, because you should only run it once. But for instance, on a previous example, we had a button and a counter and something like that. If you need that, you can always do this. You can have more than one use effect. So you can have one for the data that you only wanted to run once, and once only. And then you can have another one that handles all the timers if you need, whatever you need. So that you also separate a little bit of responsibilities, because if by mistake you update this one every time, then your server that has the API will die, because it gets so many calls so fast that's really bad to do. Or your browser will run out of memory, which is even worse. So, because again, use effect and use state and all the hooks, you can use more than once. It's true, if you read online, a lot of people say it's not recommended to use a lot, but it depends what's your use case. Can you solve it in another way? If not, then use it. Again, a lot of those opinions are a bit like, oh, your app gets slower. But if you commit a mistake like this, your app gets even slower. So it's also a trade-off of what you need to do.
On that point, you won't get slow, you won't run.
Yeah, it won't. It will break your browser basically. So we saw two use cases for use effect. One to fetch data now, and the other one to pause and the timer, which was also an interesting one. So yeah, now in here we have all the repository list. Now, sometimes in some websites, when this happens, when the data is loading, sometimes you see like some sort of animation or whatever happening like while the data is loading, right? When, for instance, on Facebook on the phone, like if you scroll, you see that thing spinning. Mm-hmm. That's because inside of your component here, you can actually create conditions. So we know by our log that the list is empty, and then it's not empty. So we can do something, and this is going to get a bit ugly because it's a lot of words. No. Mm-hmm. 0. So if this happens, otherwise does that.
Okay.
Now it's really fast, right?
Yeah,
but you can see that loading is there and then it disappears. But it's also because the GitHub API is really, really fast. So in this type of scenarios, it's a bit weird to have that loading. But what we just wrote here, this is no different than an inline if that you know, which is you have a condition, question mark, and then the true and the false.
It's a ternary operator,
Yeah,
isn't it?
exactly. And you can always mix, because again, inside of these brackets, as long as you are inside of the return, right? Mm-hmm. Inside of the brackets, you can always write HTML, which is JSX. So this is completely valid, even though it looks a bit weird, like, oh, there is HTML here and JavaScript here. But it's 100% legal. It's no problem at all. Now, for instance, one thing that a lot of people do is that you would have a loading component. Wait. And yeah, it doesn't have to do that. It's just a div saying it's just this. So in here, instead of us doing this, we actually do this, which again, is exactly the same thing. It's just that it would make this one reusable. Like we could just export it, and then we can use it anywhere else. So this makes your components a little bit more reusable, because probably if you are fetching stuff from an API, you might do it from in more than one place. So you might need to show a loading in more than one place. But again, this is not needed to do in this case, but it's just that in here you can either have HTML or a component on itself. So so yeah, this would be a what's it called? Conditional rendering, because you have a condition, and if one thing loads that, if another loads that. Now, as you can probably imagine already, I'll remove this console log from here. You can use this conditional rendering to show or hide components, because we know how to use state, right? So let's just have one more state. Why not? Show and set show false. Now somewhere here, I'll just put an HR so that we a button show, and then on click. What? No. Come on. What did I do? Okay. Equals. And then we call it set show to not show. Actually, no, we will. Because again, if we want to use variables, it needs to be inside of the curly brackets so that we have JavaScript there. So if we say show, then this is secret. Otherwise, no. So with this type of features, you can as you can imagine already, you can very easily control like a drop down or hide. That's basically exactly how it gets done. It doesn't really get done with crazy JavaScript. It's 1, 2, and 3 lines to make and show and hide, basically. And again, yes, it requires a little bit of muscle memory to think about the state and how it works, but this is one of the reasons why React is really good. Is because you can do something that it could take a little bit of going around and around and around, and how to actually invalidate, and then how to actually show, and blah, blah, blah. And in here, we have basically show and hide button with 3 lines of code. It's also because, of course, we can do this crazy thing. One note is that in here we won't get the error. But if you do not want to return any visible thing, you should return null. That's basically what we are doing here. I mean, we are not returning anything, we are just printing out. But to print out an empty HTML component is null. It's better than if you would write a div, for instance. This would be not that good, because that actually creates a div somewhere.
Yes.
And it's probably, yeah, it's empty. But this would not be nice to have, because you have an empty div on your code, and that's not good to have. So instead of doing this, you should always return null. Or not always, but if you don't want to show anything, return null.
Oh, double end can work, isn't it?
Hmm?
If we place a double end instead of the question mark.
Oh, yeah. This one.
And
Yeah, the problem of this one
yes.
is that in some cases it can no, come on, get away. In this case we won't see it because it's a true or false, but if it would be a number, it would still show the number. For instance, how to explain it. If we have 1 and then somewhere down here we set it to 0, let's say. No. Is it 0? Or maybe a number still doesn't. No, a number still works. But it's I mean, the only tricky thing of using the ampersand is that if this would be something else but a boolean, and again, if it's number 0 or 1, it works, it gets interpreted as a boolean, it can get printed on a website. And sometimes that happened for me because I'm saying like, oh, if this string is there, then do not show this. But by doing that comparison, the string actually gets printed sometimes. So for these cases, if you use booleans, you can do this. That's completely fine. Or, of course, you can do this. Same, reaches the same purpose. Yeah, now we should show 2 and hide 2. Yeah. Just to have it different. So, so yeah, this is a way of the state to change your visible content. Now, not only it can change the visible content, it can also help you on styling things. Now, how to do that? Where should we do that? Let's do it here.
That's very convenient, the
Yeah.
title there. PH2 help me. Very appropriate, I would
Yeah.
say.
So in our CSS, now I'll just open the CSS here. How can I close this? Yeah. Okay. Oh, no. I don't know. So now, if we do this, as you can see, yeah, it shows the style because we are loading the class there, help, right? Oh, yeah, that's so, and that's normal CSS as we know it. Now, again, one of the reasons where do we have other CSS? Yeah, okay. So in here we have a regular class name saying equals and then quotes repository list. And this is acceptable. But also this, we can use as a JavaScript object and then have whatever we want inside. We can do a regular string like with quotes, right? We can do this. This is still valid. All that is valid. Now the reason why I'm using the template strings, the tick, is because, as you probably know, you can do this and you can have JavaScript values here. So now if I do this help show, when we look here, it says help false because it actually got the value of show. So with this, we can say show, and this one can get a bit help, otherwise empty. So now the class is actually empty. Oh yeah, and now if we click, it actually got the value for it. We probably can change. Oh, I don't have px. That's why it's not changing the size. So yeah, so you can style the elements also depending on your state by just applying a class or not to it.
Can you show me what is the state that you set it on the top?
In here, I just have a show and set show with false as default. And then I'm using the same that we were using to show the secret part or not. So in here, we can combine something like this, and that helps us to also like. Okay.
I did use that the stuff on the class to use the key and add that, let's say, on a list item, so that if you want to have each list item with a different class, so you can also add numbers to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it goes like, item 1, 2, 3 as a class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can pass any JavaScript value on it. That's also why if we just wrote the show, it would just print the value of show, which is false or true, depending on the type. So you can actually have default ones, because in here, if it's not show, then it gets the not help class, which is there. And then when you click, it just updates the class. And you can see it just changed there. So basically, I just define 2 JavaScript CSS classes, and then use them accordingly to my needs, basically. So for instance, this is a very easy way to, your state interferes with the style of the component. Let me just see if I'm not derailing too much. Yeah, control inputs, we should talk about that. Where was it? Here, okay. Okay, so now we saw state for a lot of different things, to use arrays, to use names, to strings, to use numbers, the count, to use true or false, the booleans to show, hide. Now, one of the big problems in React, or not problems, actually solutions in React, is the forms, the input fields and the click events and all that. Now there is I think it was here, docs here, control components, right? Yeah, it's exactly where I was. Yes. So, and again, in the React documentation, not only in our documentation on Hack Your Future, but also on the real React website, they still talk about the class components, because again, a lot of people are still using it, so they kind of need to always go back. That's why it's also good to understand what's kind of happening here. So the main problem of having an input field, and we already have a couple of them here, I'll just duplicate it, and I'll remove a lot of the things. So new name. So now we have 3 input fields here: name, description, and new name. And as you tried a long time ago, probably input fields, I'm not sure if you did in HTML, probably did, yes. They are quite special because they have values that you need to handle. For instance, when you click on submit or when you click something. But in React, usually you don't really use those values per se. You use the state to control those values, so that you control the entire input field. Or, I mean, I'm saying a lot input, but the text area, the check marks, everything that it's form related, all the type of tags. Now I cannot remember all of them. But all of them, you control them, and not the HTML itself does not control it. That's also why they called it controlled fields, if I'm wrong. Controlled inputs, yeah. So the way that works, I need to go back to the website, and I'll remove this one, is that you create a regular input field. Again, the placeholder, this is an HTML feature, so that it creates that placeholder there. That's why it says name there. But then you usually need to give it a value and an onChange function. In every single input field, you should do that. Now the value, again, it's going to be state, unless you need to have it pre-filled for some reason. But usually a value, it's always going to be a state. So I created this new repo name and set new repo name as an empty string. Get out of there. And I set it as value there on this input field. And I also gave it a function saying handle change name. Now, if we go to the function, and we can log here. And let's not update the state. So, as you can see, every time I'm doing something, actually nothing gets done because it gets overwritten by itself because it's not being controlled. It's using an empty string as state. So what we need is to, and this might sound like, oh, this is a very heavy job to do. Every time we change something, we are setting it back and back and back. So for instance, now if I type, it just keeps appending to it. Because on change, I'm saying set the repo name with whatever value is there. And then the value is the whatever value is there.
Can you just hold a little bit down?
Yeah, I will try to actually
Then you
I
have to pass this into a database.
I can move it here. Maybe it's visible. No, set repo name. I will paste this whole thing down so we can actually have the whole view in one page. Yeah. Okay, so what? I will hide the delete as well. Do we have the whole? Yes. So basically, here we have it started as empty, and we are using the value of it. New repo name here. And then we have this function that this, as we know, sets the state of this, sets the value of this state variable here. And we have this handle name change, which over here we are just setting new repo name with whatever value is there. So every time, like the on change gets triggered every time something changes on the input. That's exactly what the name means. So every time it changes, for instance, you click A, it changed, trigger this. When it triggers this, it says like, oh, set it to A, because that's the value I have right now. And by doing this, re-renders, right? So now this one is A. And then you click B, this one gets triggered. Well, the value was A, but now it has B as well. So this one is AB. So set that as value.
So even the target to the value is just adding to value?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's doing something that it might seem really, really dumb because that's the regular behavior of an input field. Every time you type something, that something is there, right? That's why if we create a completely empty input.
Is that why some form fields, they are like broken down in 2, 3, so they don't like re-render the whole form? I mean, I've seen some form fields, they break it down.
Yes and no. That's not the main. That's not the main reason. Because again, this is not a very heavy thing to do. It's not. But for instance, that input field is completely like there is no state on it. There is no on change. There is nothing, and it works, right? It doesn't need this complexity of updating itself over and over again. But to actually use those values to actually do something with it, because that's basically what we want. We want to fill out name and description, and then when we click, we want to use those. Then we need to save it on state. And to save it on state, that's why we need this kind of controlled one, which, again, I did it in this way, but a lot of times you see this.
Yeah.
There is one too many.
That would make it crazy in the beginning.
Yeah, a lot of times you see this, and this works fine as well. That's the reason why I moved it to its own function. But what's doing here is exactly the same that we were doing here. Again, I'm calling this E, but this can be called whatever we want, but because this is an event.
Now, okay, Could
So-
you, because now you're just setting, now can you, what was my question? Because now you have the handle name change, right? Now, would you be able to do like a function to handle all, like with the, set repo name? Or,
No.
No, because you have different values for each.
Yeah.
Okay,
And different events for
Yeah.
each.
okay.
And again, that's the reason why people usually do this, so that it's a bit shorter, like, and you don't have so many functions here. Because yes, if you have a very, very big form, that's a little bit crazy to have all those things there. And again, if you have a very big form, because in here we do not have a form tag, I just have an input one, and I actually can use the values of it without having a form, without submitting a form. Because if you actually have a lot of fields, then you should have a form and actually only handle on submit. Because once you click on submit, then you can give me all the fields of this form in one event. I'm not sure what's the name of it, but I think it's event target values. I'm not sure. But then you get all of them. It's just that in here, I only have these two inputs. And yeah, I mean, I don't need a form here because then, for instance, when I click on a button, I have this handle on the button. That is found there, and it's hidden. So, okay, I will actually remove this from here so that we have one of each, basically. Because the description has a handle description on change, and that's exactly the same, as you can see, event.target.value. Now, when we click on the button, so for instance, hey, here. Now, if we click add new, it added a new one. So let's look at the code and try to understand what's happening. Again, the button only calls a function, so I'll just show the function because that's what we need to look at. So in here, I'm doing something dumb as well, but it's just to prevent it to actually add an empty name. So I'm doing this. I'm saying, oh, if the name is empty, no, I don't want it. And this new repo name is a state, right? It's the state we defined here. So whenever we click, whatever the user has written there, as you can see, it's still A actually. That was the value here. So in here, I'm actually doing exactly the same we did on the previous class. I'm making a copy of the current repository list. I'm doing a new one with a new name, a new repo description, and the stars is 0. And then I'm pushing it into the copy, and then I'm setting the copy there. This part, I didn't change anything. I mean, I just changed, because before we had them hard-coded, I think. I'm not sure about that. So that's basically what you need to do to actually create an input field that does something. But again, does something on a state, because if you refresh, the new field is gone. But that's the same thing we had.
Unless you do some work on the back end and
Yeah,
write on the
exactly.
file, write on a JSON or something, then it will stay there, because then it will fetch from the JSON file.
Yeah. Now, one error that I have on my code here is that if I had it here, but now I can actually, because I'm not clearing that.
Then we should add in the button.
Okay.
Yeah, on the handle new, which is the one that the button does. So we set the repositories. Now we should set the new repo name
To empty string.
to empty and do exactly the same. New repo description to empty. So now, of course, it reloaded the entire application. So if we add something, now they are empty again. So now it prevents me to add the same thing or for the forms to stay there. To be honest, I've seen production websites from big companies not clearing their fields after you submit something, and that's terrible to do. Like, because you should always clear it. Like, you just submitted something, right? Then, I mean, that also gives you very bad. It gives that the code is quite bad if it's doing that. But that,
Especially when you land on a home page and there's someone
Yeah.
else's information there.
but again, this is very common because you can forget to do it. Again, if you have a lot of fields,
Yeah.
that's also why you should handle it on a form submit
submission.
and not per field, because
Yeah.
then you need to clear each single one. And if you have a form one, you can just say clear the entire thing.
I think the form submission on itself, it clears the values. I mean,
Yeah, but if you use React to control it, then it doesn't. That's also the problem, is that the native behavior gets overwritten because we want to override it. So yeah, this is basically how to create some fields that do what we expect it to do. When we look inside of our repository, so in here I was just trying something, or no, it was not on this one, it was another one. But this is exactly the same as we had before. We have this counter, which again should not work like this. You should only be able to click once if it's to star. And in this case, we could use a combination of what we did before, a use effect and a variable, so that we say like only update whenever I tell you to update. The timer pause type of thing. Because a lot of times for this, and you can imagine like it's a very tiny solution, right? Oh, when I say star, it should go 1. But then if I say unstar, it should go minus. This is it's a very simple thing,
yeah.
but it becomes tricky because you need you need 2 states and 1 use effect for it, which is a bit crazy, but that's basically what you need.
I think we can do it like
Star
false
and
or
star.
true and false. Something like we can set state, use
Yeah.
state like true and false, and this start number should read from the server actually.
Yeah. That's how it should
Yeah.
how it should be technically.
So if it's true, you just count 1. If it's false, you just
Yeah.
count -1.
Yeah, and again, as you can imagine, somewhere here there should be a call to the server to say somebody started, marked it as star. But we are not doing that here now. Another thing I have here, if you look at this button, and this is the button star, when you inspect it here, you can see that there is a style, an inline style here. And I know you probably got told never do inline style, but welcome to React. You can do it. It's not recommended, of course, but you can do it. Now the way of doing it is this. And yes, the namings are different because in CSS, and I can open it here.
You can use dash.
Yeah, you would write margin. Oh, it's because I don't have a semicolon. Yeah, you would write it like this, right? 10px, whatever. But in JavaScript, you need to write it together because dashes are not. You cannot use dash in variables or keys, or that's the reason why. So, for instance, all the 2-word properties are 1 word with capital. So, for instance, background
Pascal.
color. Yeah, with Pascal
How long
naming.
you can add? If you want to add another one,
You can add as many as you want.
you make a command.
Oh, yeah, it works as an object. So
Oh.
background color pink, and yeah, it just works as an object, and you can have as many as you want.
Okay, and then it will be translated in CSS.
Yes,
with
yes,
dash.
it gets
Wow.
translated. I mean, it's React doing that for us. It but again, a lot of people do not recommend this.
But you can do it.
But yeah, you can do, and if it's something, let's say that the state changes, like we did with this one here, right? Now this one changes 2 properties, changes color and color and font size, and it makes sense to be on the CSS because it is CSS properties. So, I mean, technically, we have 2 ways of doing it, and I would argue to say that none of them is wrong. For me, at least. There are people with a lot of different opinions. Just because this one might make the code a little bit hard to read because there is a lot of quote marks and whatever, and you can write pure CSS on it.
Why do you have 2 curly braces inside, Martin?
Oh, yeah, you have to. That's because the style if we open here, CSS properties, yeah, the style is in where this is not readable.
The style class on CSS, it already has a curly brace. So you
Yeah.
have two of them. You need two of them.
No, it's actually one of the main reasons is because inside is an object.
Okay.
So, and basically you cannot pass an object as a root. Like this is not an object. This is two
Just
two values.
telling that it's
Yeah.
JavaScript.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you need to say like this is an object that I'm sending here, basically. So yeah, there is this this thing.
What
you can
text
use.
editor are you using, Mark?
VS Code.
Ah, okay.
I just have a light theme so that my eyes don't hurt, and it gets better on a video as well.
I just had to eye drops because my eyes.
No, but when I
It's-
code, I have it dark.
Ah, yeah.
At work, I have it dark, but because the dark one, the video gets a bit weird when it
Yeah.
renders. So the light one is better to presentations and
Choice.
stuff like that. Now, there is two things I would still like to talk about today.
Mhm.
One of them is the delete. So we have this delete button here. Now, now the delete button is here, and it's inside of a repository. But we are actually changing the state of the parent, right? Because we are deleting from repositories, and that's here. So what I said half an hour ago, that the child never touches the parent, that's not true. It's doing it right here. So for instance, let me make just a console log. Log. Parent gets updated, or no, rendered, something like that. Now in here, oh yeah, this is gonna, it's okay. Now we have 3 components. So the child gets rendered, it gets printed 3 times. That's the reason why, right?
Mhm.
I will remove these results from the console log so we have a clear view of what should we trying to achieve. So parent gets rendered once. That parent gets rendered again because we just got the data. And as you can see, like here, none of the childs got rendered because we did not had any data. Again, it's the fetch that's doing that. And then child gets rendered 3 times because we have 1, 2, 3. So if we add a new one, and as you can see, this is one of the issues of having child, is because every time we are updating the state of the parent. So all those got changed every single time we touched one key. Now again, this is okay because it's not that heavy. But if the child would have a lot more childs and whatnot, then you could see that this would go insane, like everything gets re-rendered. Now I cleared it, so now if we delete one of them, now the parent got re-rendered, even though the delete button is on a child. But what's happening here is that there is no handle delete on the repository, right? I'm not defining anything. I'm just calling a onDelete that actually comes as a prop. And this one I think might be one of the hard ones to probably fit on the head. I don't know. I will zoom out just a little bit. Is it still readable?
Yeah.
A bit, yeah. So here, when I'm printing, when I'm mapping through the list and say like create 1, 2, 3, 4 repositories, I'm actually sending an onDelete, and I'm sending a function. And then on the repository, I'm just on click, I'm triggering that function. So whenever I click on the child, the function that was defined on the parent gets triggered, because you can pass functions as parameters. We learn in JavaScript that a parameter of a function can be a function, right? And that's something that sometimes might be a little bit hard to understand and to get it. But somewhere here, that's why when you ask to see like, oh, can I see the on delete, what does it do? It does exactly this based on one ID, and I'm passing the index of the array to it. So for instance, maybe if I show the components here. No, this, yeah, because the onDelete is empty here, we cannot really see it. But so we know as an array, yeah, here we know that part. But as an array, this is position 0, position 1, this is position 2. So this button here as a function that function already has parameters, which is index 0, index 1, index 2. That's basically what we are doing here. I'm passing a function per component. I'm passing a function saying handle delete with the value 0, handle delete with the value 1, because I have this index from from the map, right? Oh yeah, it's in there. From the map I have the index. So I'm passing that function. I'm not calling the function. I'm passing it. That's why I'm doing that. And that's a very, very, very common mistake would be to do this. Now this triggers the function, right?
Yeah.
Because this is calling a function. Now, yeah, this is dead because we are deleting while we are printing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we are passing it as a anonymous function saying like, oh, the child, and this one is the child, you have the possibility to trigger this thing. And because we have it here, then we say, oh, whenever someone clicks, trigger that thing. And in here, we don't need index, we don't need anything, because we get the function that triggers it. So in here, we define it, so giving it an ID probably is the wrong name, it should be an index, I think. So giving it one, we make a copy of the current list, we delete, that's what splice, if you give the index, then 1 deletes that exact value. And then we set, we update the state again. So this is very similar to the create one, it just removes one. So you can imagine that every time we map, this function is being sent here. And then the child has the possibility to trigger it here. So that's one of the ways of the child component to affect the parent, is if the parent gives the child tools to affect it. And that sounds very parenting stuff, but it's exactly the same.
But I can't see where on delete is defined.
On delete is not defined anywhere. On delete is just a value.
A parameter.
Yeah. So for instance, now in here, instead of sending this one, we send a console log of repo.name. And we only changed on a parent. We didn't change the on delete anything. So now if we go here and we try to delete, it console logged the name of the one we are looking at.
Yeah.
So this one is
Just a name.
yeah, it does not care what you're sending. It just knows it's a function and I'm going to trigger it. Or I can trigger it whenever I want. So again, this example is not really part of this this part of the lesson, but it's just something that is really good to know. And we will work more in this type of
Welcome.
yeah.
What if we pass the anonymous function to the child with an ID? You
Oh yeah,
yes.
yeah. You can pass.
That should be on the child. You know, the anonymous function should be on.
Yeah, you can pass an anonymous function without the ID,
yeah.
but then you need also to pass the ID
The ID
to the child. Yeah.
to the parent.
So if you would do something like this, I don't think this will work right away. But then the onDelete does not have any parameters, because in here we don't know.
We pass the index as a prop.
Yeah, we need to pass the index so that we can use it.
Yeah.
But that, for instance, if we need to change something, then we need to change two properties.
Yeah, the function
And like this, this one does not care. This one just knows that the on delete probably should delete something and does not have to do any logic, does not have to combine anything. It just triggers this one. That's it. So if for some reason we want to prevent delete and just do something like this, for some reason, then we did not have to change anything on this component, on the child component. We only changed the parent, and we only made changing one specific line. So this also gives a lot of opportunities for reuse the code as much as possible. So we don't have any crazy logic on a child component. The child component is very, very simple. But this one can basically do all the logic that it wants.
But up on the ID, why you don't put it inside the parentheses?
Which
In the const handle delete, the ID, the parameter.
here,
Why you don't put it in?
it doesn't need to.
It's same.
Yeah, it's same. I mean, if it's only one, it doesn't have to, but yeah. It's actually because if I do it on code sandbox, actually it removes it automatically because it refactors the code. So it removes all the unnecessary stuff. But and actually I did it first on code sandbox and then I downloaded. So that's why it's a bit of a mix of things. Now, again, a property of a component, a prop of a component, as you can see, can also be a lot of things. It can be a name, a string, it can be a number, it can be a function, it can be a lot of things. Now, and actually, last class you mentioned something about C#, that it's annoying because you have to type everything you want to use. So that's a very good thing because it makes it type safe, which means that, for instance, so in here, I can send
Should be end.
a string saying, hey, right? Oh, yeah, now I have that. Okay, no, this one is a bad example. Let's remove this from here, and then I'll explain what is that. So, for instance, I'm sending a number into something that should not be a number. The title should be a string. I mean, in GitHub can be a number actually, but let's say it should be a string. Now, we learned a long time ago that you can always check the type of.
Yeah.
So somewhere here on the beginning of it, we can say like if type of name difference from string, then throw an error saying like, hey, I need a string. But writing type of for every single parameter on your code would make your code like 4 times as bigger as it should be. So for that, people from React, and this is actually their project as well, created something called prop types, which basically tries to specify types in the JavaScript, basically. Because again, there are a lot of languages that are type safe. Sometimes you might hear that, like, for instance, TypeScript is type safe. That's why it's called TypeScript. JavaScript is not. Anything can be anything, basically. You cannot enforce anyone to do it. So they created this to help, actually. Again, it cannot really enforce. It still works. The website will work completely fine. It just will throw a lot of errors on the console. But the website works. There is no. It doesn't prevent you to do it. It just tells you, please don't do it. You know, that's the problem of JavaScript, that it does not enforce you to do those things. Now, these prop types is something that I installed as an npm package. Where is it? Here. So you have to run npm install prop types, and then it gets whatever version is there. Now, okay. Now the way that it works is that you have to import it, prop types, and it says default, import default, export default type of thing. And then every time you define a component, no matter if it's functional or class or whatever, after you define it, and you can actually export it before, because in here I'm actually exporting it, and only after I'm doing that, it still works fine. You can do the component dot prop types, and then this creates you an object. And now in here, you can specify, and this relates to the names we are putting there. Again, it doesn't help you on autocomplete or anything. You need to keep an eye on if you change this from name to repository name, then you need to update this one, then you need to update everywhere where you use it. So basically in here, you can define, for instance, this is your parameter, and then you type prop types dot, and now in here you have a lot of options, but again, usually it's string and number that we use. On the React website, they have the type checking with prop types also, and they have all the options you can have on basically on your prop types. Now, a very good thing is, for instance, the name in here, we are saying that it's a string, right? Because we want it to be a string. So because we are sending 1, 2, 3, it's telling us, hey, it expects a string, but you give it the number, so it should not. So now we can go here, and actually we can do this. That's already a string, even though it contains a number, but officially it's a string. Now, if we do this, oh yeah, we need to completely remove it. Now, there is no problem in our, like, everything works fine on our website, even though we are not showing a name, and we should. And we are not being told that we should give a name, right? When you look here, everything is fine on your code. There is no errors, there is no compilation errors, there is no run errors, there is nothing for us. So that's why the prop types are also good, because you can say, okay, the name is of type string, and then if you click, you can say is required. So now we have an error. Again, the website still works fine, but at least we have an error saying like, hey, I need a name because it's required. You need to give me a name. So then, of course, you go back there and then you say repo.name to it. And yeah, now there is no errors because everything is there. Now, as I said, like the function, for instance, it's a tricky one because it's not really a string or a number or an object or whatever. So prop types actually has the function type, and you can of course set it as is required or not, because I mean, in this case we don't have anything that that is conditional. But for instance, if we can very easy get something on page. Okay, yeah. So we do have a value on page here. So now we're gonna have on page, and I'm gonna add on page here of prop types dot string, and this one is not required. So if you actually use VS Code and you have prop types installed, it should also help you on autocomplete. For instance, if we do this, it actually shows you like, oh, you can have this one and this one. So the delete was there. Now we're gonna add on page. On page equals repo.onPage. Okay, we don't see anything happening, but okay, what would we like? in here, if home page exists, then we would like a tag with the href to home page and home page here, because from my repositories only one of them has the home page. So for instance, in here we should not put this as required, because if we do, and we know that our data not always returns it, then it's going to give us an error, which is really stupid. We should know our data before using it. So if this is a possibility, then this one should not be marked as required, because again, we are actually only printing it if it exists. So that's when that's when you know if you need to define it required or not. Is if there is a condition for this to happen, then it should not be required. So yeah, this, as you can see, it prints it here, and the other one too, they don't have it, so it won't even do anything. And again, I would really recommend you to install prop types in your project and use them, because that also that kind of documents your component as well. So for instance, if you do a component like this repository, and yes, I mean, I can read these variables, right? I understand what they mean. But by looking here, I actually know what this component needs to work. So 4 of them are marked as required. So if I want to use this component, I need to have those values somewhere. Mm-hmm. So this also gives you a lot of documentation, basically, that not only gives you the errors on the website, but it gives you documentation so that you know what your component needs to run.
And we will only do that on the children where the parent uses it?
Yeah, I mean, this, for instance, the repositories one does not require any prop, so no, this one does not need. But the one we had here, the header, should have, because it has name. So basically, all the way down here, no, that's subheader. We should have a header dot prop types equals, what was name? No, prop types dot string dot is required, and we probably need to import it. Yeah, we do. So I mean, now we did not see anything because we are passing a name to it. Mm-hmm. But now if we go to our Git home and for some reason we forget to do this, now we get an error on our code. So again, once you build a website with a lot of components, this is very, very useful, because sometimes you're like, oh, why is things not showing visually? And probably because you are not passing the arguments that it needs to show. So by defining this, then you get an error, and the error is...
When you work in the sandbox, you don't need to import prototype.
Yeah, you can.
I need all that.
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, on Code Sandbox, for instance, in here, I'm not sure if it's that visible. I mean, to add dependencies on Code Sandbox is by clicking this button and then searching for them. So if you search for prop types, yeah. And I mean, I already have it installed because it's there. So for instance, on my repository here, I'm actually doing it as well. Mm-hmm. And again, it will give you an error if you're doing the wrong thing. So again, this is, I might understand, is very tedious. It takes time to write, but it's really good because it documents your component, and it also shows other people how to use this component. So if you're working in a big project, sometimes like, oh, I'm going to use this component, but then what does it need? I mean, these ones are small. You can really easily read, but when you look at the repositories, it's already quite big to read. and it's not that complex. It doesn't do a lot of things. So you can imagine in a big application, it's very, very hard to read. So if you have something like this, it makes it at least like you know what it requires. And of course, if the code is doing something that actually requires, but it's not defined there, then the developer who did the code did it wrong. Because if you are really using the name and you're not saying is required, then that's wrong. That's an error, basically, you have on your code.
What type of JavaScript is React using now? This is the plain JavaScript, no version like in Angular they're using TypeScript.
Yeah.
In React.
React you can use both, actually. You can use JavaScript or TypeScript.
So you can also do that name as string, like in the parameter.
Yeah, if you're using TypeScript,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
But again, if you're using TypeScript, it requires a little bit more configuration. They do React TypeScript. They should have it on their website. I actually think that now it's even but this is with templates. I don't think you need those anymore. I cannot be 100% sure. Because for instance, if you create a new React app on your no, it doesn't come with TypeScript automatically. But yeah, there is support for it. It's just that, for instance, you cannot have .js files. You need to have .tsx files because they require special configuration. But you can use, I mean, at work I use it TypeScript. I don't use JavaScript to write React. Which again, that requires a lot of typing, a lot. And you won't do it like this, you do it in a different way. But yeah. Okay, so now let's try to resume this class. The only thing, and you might think I'm lying, but I'm not. I did not talk about children. I talked about child components.
Yes.
They are two different things. But we will talk about that next class. It's just that child components is a component that we render here. This is a child component. The word children is for other things that we will learn next class. But this class, we talked about the controlled inputs, that we always need to have a state and a handle function to actually handle the state of the function, of the input. Yeah, and as it's explaining here, is React that controls it, not the browser. We use data fetching with the use effect. We also found a very cool example for the use effect with the counter, stop counter.
Yeah.
So that was nice. And we talked about prototypes. And we also learned how to pass a function as a prop. And
Just like in add event listener on the manipulating the DOM.
Yeah.
Like you're just passing.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically it. But yeah, I think that